guys. Thanks for being flexible today. I know you were really devastated not to have class at 8 o'clock, but now you get to listen to this video, watch the video, and listen to my lecture. So I encourage you to have your book out and take notes just as you normally would in class. I'll try my best to have good energy and make it interesting. It's always kind of awkward for me to just sit here talking to a computer screen, but I'll do my best. Okay, so Anne Bradstreet, if you open your text up to page 207, you can see that she lived from 1612 to 1672, and she was born in Northampton, England, in a very prominent family. In fact, her father was a very well-known member of their community, was highly involved, and he was a Puritan. And Anne was kind of the apple of his eye. So for that reason, he believed in education. So for a girl of this time period in the 1600s, she was very well educated. Most women in this time period, they may have known how to read and write, but that was about the extent of their education and didn't spend a whole lot of time reading books or literature or anything. But Anne was very fortunate to have a father who invested in her education. So back in these days, they got married pretty young. So she had come to know this guy, Simon, who was a graduate of Cambridge, also a Puritan. And they got married when she was 16, which is kind of crazy to us now, but back then was very normal. And so both her father and, she as a young married woman and Simon did travel to America with the Massachusetts Bay Company. So this is later, all right? The Pilgrims went in 1620. Let's see if I can get a date here. I don't think your book says the date. Anyway, it was after Plymouth plantation, and the Massachusetts Bay Company is associated more with the Boston area, a little further north. So they settled there, and they say for Anne Bradstreet it was a great test of her faith, and we see that she's very authentic in her poetry, and so we'll see that she did struggle with fear and sadness at a lot of the loss that she experienced. And she's most well known as she is our first published American poet. Now, she was published anonymously, and the story of the publication of her first volume of poetry is interesting. We'll talk about this a little more later, but basically her brother-in-law knew she wrote poems and, had read several of them, and basically without her knowledge, compiled a manuscript of her poems and took them to England and had them published. And she didn't even know it was happening until they'd already been published. And it turns out they were a big hit. A lot of people liked hearing about just the everyday life in America and what it was like for these new colonists. So, interesting story there. All right, so the first poem we're going to look at is the prologue, and this is on page 208, so just one page over from the bio. And the prologue is just what it sounds like. This is about kind of when she first started writing poetry, what her expectations were of herself as a poet, what she thought others might think of her poetry. And honestly, it gets better as she goes. In my opinion, it's not one of her best poems. It's almost like she's trying a little too hard here. But it is interesting just to get a feel for her attitude towards herself. So I'll let you, the first discussion question, what are Bradstreet's expectations of herself as a poet? So I'll let you write that down, and then I'm going to read a little bit, a few stanzas here, and see what we think. All right, so these are a little hard to follow, so just do your best, follow along with me. So I'll start with the first stanza. She says, "To sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun." So all these big topics, right? Wars, royalty. She's like, to write about all this, for my mean pen are two superior things. Or how they all, or each their dates have run, let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. So, right off the bat, and a lot of people say, oh, she's just being humble. But basically, when she talks about her mean pen, she's saying that, my writing is just not as good. The word mean meaning inferior here, my inferior poetry. She's like, I'm going to stay away from these epic topics because I'm just not that great. So from the get-go, she sets these very low expectations. And you can skip down to stanza 3. She says, from a schoolboy's tongue, no rhetoric we expect, nor yet a sweet consort, which means sound, from broken strings. Nor perfect beauty wears a main defect, my foolish, broken, blemish muse so sings. So she's like, well, if the instrument is damaged or blemished or immature, then we don't expect it to create anything great. And so she's basically just labeling herself all those things. I'm immature. I'm broken. I am defective. So we'll talk about how that affects you as an audience, but it is interesting that she views herself in this way. And you have to keep in mind, she's not writing this stuff with the view of having it published. She really just wrote these poems for herself. Kind of like I teach Emily Dickinson in American Lit too, and there's a lot of parallels there. Okay, so let's talk about how she thinks her peers will view her. So she does think about what other people would say to her as a poet, specifically as a female poet. So let's skip down to stanza 5. Stanza 5 says, I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. So I do like here how she gets a little sass. She's like, well, even if I was good at poetry, people would be like, oh, she's just a woman. She plagiarized. She accidentally got one right. And you can tell that she sees herself at a disadvantage as a woman. So, do we have the very first American feminist here? It's possible, just depending on how you view it. And so then in stanza 6, I'm not going to read this one, but it talks about how the Greek poets viewed women as like their inspiration, their muse. So maybe that's the place for women. And then in stanza 7, she says, let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best and women know it well. So that, it's like she's backing off a little bit. And girls, lest you kind of like, oh, I don't like Aunt Bradstreet. Why is she so weak? This is what has been pounded into her head her entire life, that males are superior talkers, thinkers, strategists, what have you, and the woman's place is much more domestic and nurturing. So these are just all the issues she's struggling with as a poet and finding her voice. And so the last stanza, I'll let you write this down first. And again, I wish I had y'all in class so I could get some feedback, but people react to her humility in a couple of ways. Some people find it very appealing, like, wow, she's so humble, and that's what makes her a great poet. Other people might find it a little annoying, like, gosh, woman, why do you have such low expectations of yourself? But it's so hard for us to place ourselves into this context in this time period. So, if you are among the crowd that finds her humility a little obnoxious, try to give her a break. But let me read just these last couple lines. She's talking about she's talking to, like, the professional poets, the men. She says, "O ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your prey still catch your praise, if e'er you deign these lowly lines your eyes." So, great poets, if you ever read my poem, give time or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. So just, I don't need like an Olympic medal. I just would like some kindness. And then she says, "This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine." So what those last two means, she's like, well, my poetry is going to be so bad, it's going to make yours look even better by contrast. So I'm actually doing you a favor by writing this bad poetry. Then there's also been some speculation as if, does she write this a little tongue-in-cheek? Is there a little humor here? And that's a valid question. I honestly tend to doubt it just because of her Puritan background. They weren't a particularly humorous people. But anyway, so that, again, just kind of sets the tone for who Anne Bradstreet is and her thoughts about being a female poet. So this next poem, The Author to My Book, this is probably my favorite. This one in Upon the Burning of Her House. They're such amazing poems. But you're going to need to turn over quite a few pages. Get over to page 225. Okay. So this one, I start off by, again, giving you the context. And I mentioned this in her bio, but you want to associate this particularly with this poem. Bradstreet's brother-in-law took her poetry to London and had it published without her knowledge or consent, which just goes to show, again, how women were treated in this time period. They really didn't have a whole lot of voice in anything. So anyway, so this poem is specifically a reaction when it says the author to her book. She is reacting to this first book of poetry. And in fact, we see here a good deal of what we call apostrophe, is a literary term wherein you address an inanimate object. It's kind of like personification, but she's not just personifying her book, but in some instances she's actually talking directly to it. So, I'm going to go ahead and let you write down the next discussion question, and then we'll read a little bit and let you answer it. So this poem in general, there's an overall metaphor as she's talking to her book, as evidenced in the title, that she makes a comparison. All right, so let me read a little bit of this to you. "Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge." Okay, so she's talking to her book, and she compares it to her offspring, her child. And she says, "Thou ill-formed offspring." So my, deformed child that someone stole from my side and exposed to the public. And if you really think about it, that is, think if someone took, your diary or your journal or something that was very private and published it to the world. I mean, that's pretty intense, and that's what she's experiencing. And so she's got all these different emotions. There's definitely shame here. She feels like everyone is seeing, her errors. Look at line 6? "At thy return," so when she finally found out about it, "my blushing was not small." Or a little understatement there. My blushing, I was scarlet. I was so embarrassed. "My rambling brat in print should mother call." So she calls her book a brat in print. So this is pretty strong language. And as we read a little bit more, her overall attitude towards her work is complex. She is, she's frustrated, she's embarrassed, It's almost like this book was like a bad child that needs to be punished. But look at the next few lines. Look at line 10. Thy visage, which just means face, thy visage was so irksome in my sight, yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend. If so I could, I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. So she's like, oh, my book is so messed up, but it's my book, so I still love it, and I want to fix it. So she talks about trying to wash its face, wash the dirt off its face. In the next line, she talks, I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet. So she's trying to just make it stand up straight and look a little better. But she just feels like she can't fix it. And I always think it's hilarious because I think so many students feel this way. Students who are real dedicated to their writing about turning in a paper, right? Like it's your paper and you might have a little embarrassment. You might try to fix it and you feel like you can't, but that paper is you. And it's just so distressing to turn it in to a critical eye because you are your own worst critic. All right, so this is Anne Bradstreet being very authentic with us about her attitude towards her poetry and how she loves it even though she sees so many flaws in it. So this I just think is a hilarious poem because I identify it. Anyone who is a creator, who creates, whether it's music or art or writing, you feel this tension where you love your work and you're invested in it, but you also have so much shame and, I can't think of the right word. You have so much invested that it's a very sensitive topic, all right? And the last few lines, she even talks about, she says, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come. All right, so try to avoid the literary critics. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. So hang out with people who don't even really know you. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out the door. She's like, tell people I was so poor that I couldn't even really dress you well for public viewing. So I'm sorry. So this is a reason I love Anne Bradstreet because she is such an authentic poet. She lets us see that window into her heart and her, the tensions that she experiences in life. All right. Next we're going to look at two about her husband. And these are actually probably the ones that she's known for the most. These poems about her husband. So page 226, To My Dear and Loving Husband. And again, I'll let you go ahead and write this down. How does hyperbole convey this poem's theme? All these literary terms that I'm throwing around right here, I'm going to give you a list of the literary terms associated with poetry on Thursday. So you can get that down and get all the definitions, but I'll be touching on these. Hyperbole is just essentially exaggeration. All right, so there's a lot of exaggeration in this poem. So we're going to look at that. All right, she says, if ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, you women, if you can. So you think she loves him? I think so. So she's using all these superlatives. Like, if ever two people became one, then we are like the definition in the dictionary. Then it was us. And then she goes on to use some more metaphors. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. So his love is way more valuable than any material possession. My love is such that rivers cannot quench. All right, so her love is like this unquenchable fire. Even a whole river couldn't put her out because she's so in love with her husband. So if you haven't caught on yet, one of the main themes here is her love for her husband. You could also say, we'll talk a little bit about this more later, but along with love, we also see a theology of oneness in her works about marriage, which is really interesting that she hits on that idea of oneness or unity which if you've done Bible studies on marriage, it's definitely a biblical thing. That oneness comes before emotion. All right. So, she goes on, and it's just kind of this gushy poem. And so I always ask my students if you find her love to be realistic or believable. I honestly, myself, I kind of go back and forth on this. You guys have been exposed to marriage. You have parents, and there are some great things about marriage, but marriage is also tough. It's also hard work. So, but, again, we don't know the context of when this was written. Maybe they just had a really nice date. I don't know. But she definitely did have a way with words of putting that passion for her husband into this poetry. So the next poem that she writes to her husband is when he's out of town, okay? So he had to take these long trips a couple times back to Europe, which, it takes a couple months to get from Europe to America on a boat. So we're talking like he'd be gone like 6 months at a time, right? 6-8 months, a really long time. And so, they wrote letters. That's all they had. No Skype. So in this poem, what I want to draw your attention to is how she uses imagery to contrast their unity, again, the idea of oneness, and distance. All right, so they are physically distant, but she also keeps coming back to this idea of oneness and how they are united. All right, so let's look at a couple examples of that. Okay. She says, my head, my heart, mine eyes, my life, nay more, my joy, my magazine, which just means warehouse, of earthly store. If two be one, then surely thou and I. So, you are my everything, and we are one. How stayest thou there, while I at Ipswich lie? So how can you be far off in London, while I am here in New England? So again, you can see the contrast of their oneness and their physical distance. And then she uses the image of the head to the heart. So many steps, head from the heart to sever, is but a neck. Soon should we be together. So we're like a head separated from its body, which is interesting because, probably two really vital things you need for existence are your brain, functionality of your head, and the functionality of your heart. So we don't really know which is which, but she uses that comparison. And then she compares herself to the earth during winter when the sun is, at its farthest astrological point. Okay, we experience winter when we aren't exposed to the same warmth from the sun as we are in summertime. So she says, I, like the earth this season, mourn in black. My sun is gone so far in zodiac. So she's like, while I enjoyed you, you caused the warm colds to melt, but now I'm cold because you are my sun. And so, and again, here's the thing. The earth revolves around the sun, right? So she definitely creates him to be the sustainer of her life. That's how she views their relationship. So she's like, oh, come back. And then lines 15, she talks about looking at their kids, and that helps her a little bit. She's like, oh, if I look at the kids, then I see you. And then, this is interesting, we actually, for this time period, in the 1600s, might even be considered a little erotic. But she says, this is line 20, I wish my sun may never set, but burn within the cancer of my glowing breast, the welcome house of him, my dearest guest. All right, so I am the house to your warmth. All right, I need you to come in and light my fire. All right, so she is very, it's not graphic, but she's very vivid with her imagery of the warmth that her husband brings her. And then the last couple lines, she says, flesh of thy flesh, bone of thy bone, I hear, thou there, yet both but one. So again, we have this imagery of distance and unity. So I did bring up her theology of marriage, and especially with the earth and sun comparisons, the idea that that in a marriage, and again, this is olden times, and we could actually argue about this all day, but the headship of a man, right? Like the head of a marriage is a man, and the woman is to come alongside. And so, like I said, I want to invoke some sort of biblical argument about, um, gender roles in marriage. But this is definitely something that was very important to her, was the idea of their oneness and his headship, his guidance of their marriage. Okay? So, pretty intense stuff, again, for the 1600s. All right, so now we're going to look at, there are a couple poems I had you read about her children, one about the death of her grandchildren. If I haven't said this before, she was kind of sickly. So Anne Bradstreet did struggle with, just kind of chronic illness. She lost children, in childbirth. Some of her grandchildren died. And that's, we aren't exposed to that as much anymore because of modern medicine, but that was very common back then. So now we're going to look at before the birth of one of her children, which you actually got to flip back to page 225. So my first question here is, let's talk about her emotion in this poem. Now, just based on the title, before the birth of one of her children, that could be a number of things, right? Like, if someone's going to have a baby, they could be happy, they could be excited, they could be anxious, they could be fearful, they could be sad for some, there are lots of different emotions that you can experience before the birth of a child. So let's see what hers is. Page 225. All things within this fading world hath end. Adversity doth still our joys attend. No ties so strong, no friend so dear and sweet, but with death's parting blow is sure to meet. So here, I think, we got end, death, parting blow, adversity. So we're going to go with her primary emotion here is fear. She is fearful of this, what's going to happen because of her poor health before her child is born. And she even says, line 6, she says, "How soon, my dear, death may my steps attend. How soon may be thy lot to lose thy friend. We both are ignorant, yet love bids me these farewell lines to recommend to thee, that when that knot's untied that made us one, I may seem thine, who in effect am none." All right, so this is actually, she's afraid of death. Sorry, I'm not keeping up with my thing here. So she's talking to her husband. All right, you guys see that again, that reference to their oneness. When that knot's finally untied in death that made us one, she's like, I just felt compelled to write this poem to you about what might happen when I have my child. So let's kind of answer that second question. How does she instruct her audience? So what does she say to her husband about her possible impending death? She says, let's see, where am I? Like line 13. "And if I see not half my days that's due, when nature would, God grant to yours and you. The many faults that well you know I have, let be interred in my oblivious grave." So here we come back to Bradstreet's trademark humility. She's like, you know what, if I die, I know that I had faults, and I hope you'll just bury them with me. All right, don't think about those. She says, "If any worth or virtue were in me, let that live freshly in the memory." So think about the good things in our marriage, right? Think about my positive qualities. "And when thou feelst no grief, as I no harms, yet love thy dead who long lay in thy arms." So when you've gotten over me, remember me, okay? "And when thy loss shall be repaid with gains, look to my little babes, my dear remains. And if thou love thyself, or lovest me," so here comes like the big command, "these O protect from stepdame's injury." So her big thing, she's worried about her kids. She's like, you get married again, no big deal, but you better watch over my babies and not let her be an evil stepmother. Isn't it amazing how far back that myth goes about the wicked stepmother? So this again is just the expression of what she's dealing with her emotions before the birth of a child. And the main thing I want you to see here, which is so fascinating to me, I ask, what role does faith play in this poem? She has been pretty meticulous about, not every single poem, but she does talk about God a lot and her faith. But in this poem, we don't really see it. She says, what nature would God grant to yours and you, but not the idea of her faith in the future. And again, I want to come back to the idea of while Anne Bradstreet does promote a lot of Puritan ideals, she is very real and very authentic with her own struggles. So a lot of people would say, well, if she were a good believer in God, then she should not be fearful, or she should show more faith that God is going to take care of her. But in this poem, she's just being realistic about her fears. And, that just makes her a more authentic poet. All right, the other poem we read about death, over on page 230, in memory of my dear grandchild, Elizabeth Bradstreet, who deceased August 1665, being a year and a half old. Her titles are very long, so I didn't type up the whole thing. So here we see, again, her attitude towards death, and here it's a little different, which is, again, it's just interesting. So let's look at the first stanza. Farewell, dear babe, my heart's too much content. Farewell, sweet babe, the pleasure of mine eye. Farewell, fair flower, that for a space was lent, then taken away into eternity. Bless, babe, why should I once bewail thy fate, or sigh thy days were soon terminate, sith thou art settled in an everlasting state. Now here again we see a Puritan idea when she says, farewell, my heart's too much content. A lot of the Puritans had this idea that they shouldn't be too happy on earth, that life in general should be pretty hard because of their sin and the weight of all the things they did wrong. So she's like, you brought me so much joy that it seemed, God just lent you to me for a short space and then he took you away. And so she has a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Resigned attitude towards death in this poem. All right, so in the second stanza, we see some nature imagery here. She says, by nature trees do rot when they are grown, and plums and apples thoroughly ripe do fall. All right, so the circle of life, you grow old, you die. Last three lines, but plants new set to be eradicate, and buds new blown to have so short a date, is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. So for the most part in nature, we do see things come full term before they die, but sometimes things in nature have a very short lifespan, and so she compares that to her grandchild. So you can get a little circle of life analogy there. Little Lion King for you. Okay, last poem. I'm trying to move through this quickly because you can pause and write stuff down if you want to. Try not to belabor things here. Okay, so this is probably Anne Bradstreet's most famous poem about the burning of our house. And here we see a very strong Puritan theology about material things. Okay? So first of all, I ask you, how does Bradstreet describe the event? And so let's read a little bit. First few lines. In silent night when rest I took, for sorrow near I did not look. So I wasn't expecting anything. I wakened was with thundering noise and piteous shrieks of dreadful voice. That fearful sound of fire and fire, let no man know is my desire. I, starting up, the light did spy, and to my God my heart did cry, to strengthen me in my distress, and not to leave me succorless, means helpless. Let's see. Then coming out beheld a space, the flame consumed my dwelling place. And when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. All right, so I think it's interesting how When I think of a house burning down, I really think of like the visual element of it, but she focuses more on auditory imagery, thundering noise, shrieks, sound of fire. So right from the beginning, we do have, it went from a silent night to all this noise. So that's an interesting contrast. She really skillfully uses that imagery to show us the kind of the trauma of the event here. All right, so she cries out to God, and then what's really interesting, I think, is this use of the word just. I just read this line. She's like, God is the one who gave and took, and if you look at the little footnote, that's from Job, right? The Lord hath taken, the Lord gave, the Lord take away, blessed be the name of the Lord. People read that verse at funerals all the time. Job said it when his life fell apart. All this stuff. When we think of the word justice, we think of getting what is deserved, right? Like that, if something is just, then it's fair, okay? So if a criminal is convicted of a crime, then we serve justice and we put him in jail or whatever. And so I always ask my students, like, was this just for her house to burn down? And many of us would react and be like, no, she's just, she and her husband are just trying to eke out a living. They're trying to raise their family. That just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right. But the Puritans, they had this huge value of not being tied to material goods. So in her mind, like her house and all of her goods, they weren't even really hers. They were God's. And so it was perfectly right. It was perfectly fair. If he wanted to burn down her house, that was okay with her. All right, so like if you look at the next line, it's like line 17. It was his own, it was not mine. Far be it that I should repine. So I shouldn't even be sad about this. He might of all justly bereft, but yet sufficient was for us left. So like we could still survive. We were fine. It's okay. So again, I just want you to see that really strong Puritan theology of not being attached to your material goods. They really, really believed that materialism was very anti-faith. So I also want to point out some personification in this poem. She personifies, her house, and she personifies her own heart, which is interesting. So it talks about how, like, she would walk by the burned down house. Look at it's like line 29. Under thy roof no guest shall sit, nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant tale shall e'er be told, nor things recounted done of old. No candle e'er shall shine in thee, nor bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. In silence ever shall thou lie. Adieu, adieu, all's vanity. So she describes all these sweet and beautiful things that would happen in her house, and then she's like, you know what, all that's it's just vain, right? It's wood, hay, and stubble. It's meaningless. So I love how Bradstreet, she does expose that she did love her house, right? She's going to miss her house. She's going to miss those things, but she kind of preaches to herself and says, no, I don't need those things. And then look at the next line. Then straight I begin my heart to chide, and did thy wealth on earth abide? Did fix thy hope on moldering dust? All right, so she's preaching to herself that Puritan theology of like, no, you can't put your hope in things. You can't put your trust in material goods. You need to put your trust and your hope in God. So she kind of walks us through this cycle that she deals with of grieving her home and then bringing herself back to her theology. So the theological idea that gives her hope is this idea of an eternal home, okay? So it's like line 43. She says, she's still talking to herself. She says, thou hast an house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect, with glory richly furnished, stands permanent, though this be fled. So she's like, I got a house in heaven. Like, this stuff can burn down. That house in heaven is permanent. So that idea of a permanent, eternal future in heaven is what gives her hope. And if you look down at the last couple lines, she says, the world no longer let me love, my hope and treasure lies above. So this is it's a great poem, and it's a very sound theology. I think especially for us here in the 21st century, where we are so materialistic, we definitely could learn a lot from the original Puritans and their focus on permanent heavenly ideals as opposed to being fixated on this earth. So I hope that gives you a great idea of Anne Bradstreet. Thank you for watching my show, listening to my speech, whatever. And I'll see you guys Thursday.